Isn't that a good bedtime story for kids? Thought just occurred to me. That's a wonderful bedtime story. And the old mean king threw the young boys into the fiery furnace. Good night, go to sleep. Sleep tight. Any bed bugs going to bite after that one? Sorry, that's bonus information. We are in our last sermon on our Old Testament sermon series that we have been going through throughout the summer, talking about heroes of our faith. And we've learned about character lessons of individuals who God spoke to and through, but also character lessons about God, about Abraham and Joshua and Moses, who answered a call to do what? To go and lead a people in uncertain and unstable times, even though they really didn't know what they were going to be doing or where they were going. They trusted in the God who made the promise to them, the God whose integrity they could trust in. And they placed their faith in that God that we call Jehovah God, or the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the God that we worship today. Or about Mephibosheth, who was an undeserving peasant who got invited to the table of a king all because of who the king was, not because of who he was. And he was broken, remember? And at the table he discovered when he looked around that he was an heir to the throne, and his brokenness was all covered up. God had made him whole. Or Gideon. Remember Gideon, the coward, the one who was trembling in fear, hiding, and God called him out. And in obedience he stepped forward, and he called him what? He called him a mighty warrior. You are a mighty warrior. Or the faithfulness of Hannah, who was so bold as to ask for a child and promise it to God. But even more so, she actually followed through on that commitment to return her only child into service to God at a very, very young age. Or Samuel, a young boy who didn't know God and heard a strange voice calling out to him. And his response was what ours should be, which is what? Speak, Lord. You've got my attention. I'm listening. And he did listen. And we learned that he did what? He led his people faithfully as a prophet and as a judge. David, we talked about the heart of God. The heart of God. See, we learned that we look at the outside, don't we? We often look at what we can see. But God looks below, and we're challenged to follow His example and look at the heart. And there's nothing more beautiful than what? Than a heart that beats in sync with God's. Last week, Elisha, where we saw imminent threat and danger, and our physical sight could only see so much. And we were surrounded. And we learned that Elisha had great faith and prayed that God would open his servant's eyes so he could see what? Those who are with us are greater than those who are with them. And we saw God, our protector and provider. I tried to put my finger on a theme as we went through these messages. And I think I came up with two words. Obedience and power. All of the stories seem to have an underlying theme of obedience from the servant, from the one to whom God is speaking. They obeyed and they followed, and they got to witness the power of God, I think, as a result of their obedience. So today we close with the story of three, actually it's four young men. Their names are Daniel, Hananiah, Azariah, and Mishael. You know them better as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And their story is pretty short, but it's really powerful. If you've never read the book of Daniel, I would invite you to read the book of Daniel. It's just a phenomenal story. It's really, really easy to read. But our story takes place 600 years before Jesus Christ is born, okay, in Babylon. Babylon is what we now know as modern-day Iraq, okay? The crown jewel of the nation of Babylon was the city which bore its name. Okay? This was a city with great culture. This was a city with hanging gardens, the 7 wonders of the world, with sport and learning and knowledge and cuisine and art. It was remarkable in every sense of the word. It was beautiful. So here's what happened. There was a king in Israel at the time who really felt like he was capable of running the nation God had entrusted to him without God's help. God, being the loving Father that He is, decided to let the stubborn king have his way. And He let him run the country without God's help. And what happened is the king of Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar, would come in and conquer Israel and would rule over it. Now, the Jewish people throughout the ancient world, they had a reputation, okay? They were intelligent. They were healthy. They were loyal. This all intrigued the king of Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar. And as trophies of war, he would take back the youngest and brightest, the best looking, the smartest, the most athletic Hebrew men from the nation of Israel. He would take them from their home and put them on the journey to Babylon. Among these young Jewish men were the ones we mentioned: Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Doesn't say how old the boys were, but I would imagine they were in their teens. And he would bring them back, and they were to be fed from the king's table. They were to be given the choicest foods so they could grow in stature and in strength. And they were to be taught by the greatest scholars in all of Babylon so they would grow in wisdom and knowledge. Now, one might think this is a good thing. But see, the king was not doing this for the benefit of the young Jewish men. The king's motives, of course, were purely selfish, right? It was all for his benefit. And he wanted these young Jewish men to be transformed into faithful, loyal Babylonian citizens. And they would become his trusted advisors. He began by stripping them of their Jewishness, of their heritage, of their faith, of their identities. The first step was all of them were given Babylonian names. They were no longer known by their Jewish names. Daniel became Belteshazzar. We typically don't know that name real familiar to us. Hananiah became Shadrach. Mishael became Meshach. And Azariah became Abednego. And they were going to be raised in the king's court, if you will, as young men. But the problem with the food that the king wanted to prepare was what? God had given the Hebrew people a list of rules, or how they were to prepare food and what they could eat, and they couldn't eat, pork or hooved it, and so he'd given them this list, and I want you to follow this. Don't defile your bodies with things that are not on this list. And so the young boys were troubled because they clung to their faith. And so they begged the king's chief advisor. They said, how about you just give us fruits and vegetables? Oh, we can't do that, because what's going to happen is you all are going to suffer, and you're not going to look as healthy as all the other boys. And so we can't do that. And they said, well, just test us for 10 days. Well, what happened, as we know in the story, is they found out that they were healthier. And the advisor said, well, let's feed all the boys this and please the king. And so God blessed their faithfulness. And it says He blessed them with wisdom and knowledge. They were smart. They were the smartest young men in the king's court. Well, the king began to get troubled because he was having this dream at night. And it was a recurring dream. And he couldn't figure out what the meaning behind it was. And so he sent out word to all of his advisors that he wanted them to interpret his dream. But the catch was, the king was not going to tell the advisors what the dream was. That someone in his court must not only tell him what he was dreaming, but interpret it for him. Or he was going to kill all of the advisors and soothsayers and wise men throughout the land. Well, this obviously troubled the four young men greatly, as it did everyone else. Well, Daniel steps forth and he says, King, there's not a man on earth that can do what you're asking them to do. But I serve a God in heaven who is able to do exactly what you say. And so Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they pray, and they ask God to give Daniel insight, and God does, and Daniel interprets this dream, which, by the way, was troubling to the king, but he was so grateful because now he knew what was on the horizon, that Daniel became the chief advisor in all of Babylon. And the three young men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they were promoted as well. See, God, in the midst of their great adversity, in the midst of their captivity, God not only protected these young men and blessed them, they thrived. Not just survived, but they thrived. A little while passes, and the king, as Susan pointed out, becomes very full of himself and wanted to celebrate who he was, because he was a great king. And so he made a statue of gold. And I'm not talking a statue of gold. I'm talking a 90-foot tall statue of gold that was 9 feet wide. 90 feet tall by 9 feet wide. And all of the king's yes men, who were, of course, jealous of the 4 young Jewish boys, all the king's yes men wanted to feed his ego, and so they said, "King, wouldn't this be a great idea if we have a celebration with this beautiful statue you've made of yourself? And what we'll do is we'll have all kinds of music, and we'll have a big parade, and we'll play the harp and the lyre and the zither." I don't know what a zither is, but it must have been magnificent. And guitars and trumpets and all this sort of stuff. And everyone in the entire nation of Babylon will fall down and worship your great statue, O king. Won't this be great? This is a time of great patriotism and great national pride in Babylon. Those who were jealous of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were pretty confident that they would do what? They would not bow before the king. The punishment, as we all know, was to be thrown into the fiery furnace. Now, this was not a buck stove or a small fireplace. This was an industrial-sized furnace that probably would have been used for making bricks and block, and would have consumed maybe a room as large as this one. And so the boys had a decision to make. Would they kneel or fall? Would they bow or would they burn? Would they remain faithful to their God and face the consequences of one small, tiny compromise? Could they make one small, tiny compromise? Would God really care? Was it that big of a deal? Everyone in Babylon would know they only did it so they could survive and stay alive. But in their hearts, they knew differently. They knew that they could not disobey their God, who had permitted them to not only survive but thrive in such a difficult setting. So regardless of the cost, these 3 young men determined that they would not succumb to the orders of the king. Now, keep in mind, this was not a political statement, okay? They were not making a political statement. I don't even think it was a religious statement. I think it was a statement about who they were and who their God was. And they could not defile themselves nor defile their God. Remember that commandment, "Thou shalt have no other gods before me." That little one got in the way, I think. So they made the decision not to bow, but rather to burn. And they would be forced to literally stand and see the power of their God. Music plays, they do not bow. They literally do what? Face the music. Well, they didn't bow. And they're brought before the king, and obviously he is furious, not necessarily because they didn't bow to him, but because they had shattered his ego. They had tarnished his ego. They would disobey the king, their God. And their reply to him was, "Oh, king, you don't understand. This isn't about you. This is about our God. And we cannot bow before any God except Jehovah, our protector, our provider. He's the reason why we have thrived, O King. Don't you understand? And if you throw us into the fiery furnace, our God is able to deliver us. Well, this made the king furious, even more so, because he was the giver of all good things in Babylon. He was in control. And he ordered the fiery furnace to be heated to 10 times the normal heat. Throw in as much wood and whatever else fuels this furnace. Get it as hot as you can get it. And throw these young men into the fire. The fire was so hot that when they went up top to toss the young men in, that the soldiers that were binding them and tossing them in, they were killed immediately from the flames. The king looks in and he sees he sees four. 4 images walking around in the fire. But only 3 were thrown into the fire, and the king is perplexed. He doesn't know what's going on. Now, some would argue that the angel of the Lord came and stood with these 3 young men. Others believe that it is the incarnate Jesus Christ that came and stood in the fiery furnace with these young men. And the king shouted out, "Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, children of the Most High God, come out." And when they came out of the fiery furnace, their clothes were not singed, their hair was not burned, there was no smoke smell. Only 3 came out. King Nebuchadnezzar was so moved that he said, "Don't say anything bad about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego's God in the entire land. We're not going to worship this God. We're just not going to say anything about it." The lessons from this story, which is just fascinating to me, are pretty simple, yet they're crucial. I mentioned how simple I was last week, and you can't get any more simple than this story. See, we all encounter moments in our faith that are crossroads, where we make little horse trades or little compromises, where we have to make judgment calls. Maybe we're not going to bow or burn, but we have to make a little judgment call of, will I remain faithful to who I am and what my God tells me, or will I make this little compromise? And we have to stand and see the power of God. And make no mistake, I do believe the world is watching the church. And I believe Princeton is watching the church. And it's not, again, political. Standing for your faith is not, I don't even think it's religious. It is about who God is and who He has called you to be, and remaining faithful and obedient. Faith, through this story, is not about what you know and what you can see. It's about whom you trust, right? Hopefully you've learned that throughout our Old Testament series. It's about whom you trust. And then lastly, I think the critical message from Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, which is just amazing to me, is that we serve a God who not only pulls us out of challenging circumstances or permits us to thrive in the midst of challenging circumstances. We serve a God who comes into the mess of our lives and walks through the fiery furnace with us. And that is fascinating to me, that the God of heaven would come and walk through life with us, not just orchestrate and answer our prayers, but He longs to come and be in what is often the mess of our lives. I'm going to do a little cleanup here. I hope that you've gotten to know about the character of God throughout this series. But even more importantly, I hope that you've gotten to know God Himself. Either for the very first time God has revealed Himself to you, or in a much more intimate and personal capacity through the stories of these characters. See, the God who calls out to you with a promise says, "Follow me, and I will lead you to a place that you do not know." but it's far better than where you are now. Or the God who reveals himself to you and empowers you to accomplish what you believed to be impossible. Asking, will you still cling to what's in your hand? Or will you let go of it and lay it down and put it in mine? Or the God who bids you to do what? Step out in faith and get ankle deep in the water and watch him part the waters of your life, making a way where there was no way. The God who recognizes what? That we're all broken. We're all broken and in need of healing, which is why he invites us to dine at his heavenly table as rightful heirs to the throne, not as peasants or scrubs, but as children of the Most High God. The God who sees that you're frightened and afraid and convinced that you can't, yet still in the midst of your fear, calls you what? Calls you a mighty warrior. The God who rewards faithfulness and obedience and good parenting with far greater blessings than we ever thought were possible. The God who calls out to us by name in that still small voice that says, Samuel, Samuel, even though you don't know me. The God who looks past our rough exterior, our selfish outer desires, and sees deep where? Deep within our hearts, and sees hearts of, again, kings and queens. The God who says, look again at your life. Things are not as they seem. Even though it looks as if the enemy has you surrounded, look again. Because I'm the God of angel armies, and those who are with you are much greater than those who are with them. Lastly, I hope you've learned about the God who wants to walk through life with you. Even though the most challenging of circumstances come your way, and you may feel that your life literally is in the fiery furnace, and what God would want to get in the messiness of your life with you. But this is a God who longs for you to invite him into the mess. So I ask you, is this a God that you want to obey, to know, to serve? I hope that's what you've gotten from this Old Testament series, is you've learned about the character of these great heroes of old, but more importantly, you've learned about the character and integrity and promise and passion and love and mercy and grace and forgiveness of a God who wants to walk through your messy life with you. If you don't know this God, the message is really simple. I would invite you to stand and see. Stand and see if he won't come to your rescue, if he won't open your eyes, if he won't permit you to see what you could not see before. I think we're at a crossroads. And we as God's people need to depend on the faithfulness of God to help us through these messy times in our lives.